Okay. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. First of all, I'd like to say for me this is a special and a wonderful opportunity to talk to you. However, I have to start my presentation with a potential disappointment. And it is, I am not an expert on the Middle East, so I should be a little bit cautious to talk too much about that. So it's maybe not too much on the Middle East, but it's more on the beyond. That means it's on what we found on the world in general. However, as you will see, how does it work? Where do yeah. No, where I can click. Okay, sorry for. Okay. Oh yeah, how it was. So sorry for the technical problem that eats into my time. Okay, you have the right to know what I will talk about. First, very briefly on the background, then on the data set we use in order to show the trends in terms of how religion and rebellion, armed conflict has developed since the Second World War. Then I will have a look at the Middle East, and then finally, connecting to the topic of this conference, I will have a look at the religious minorities and rebellion in the Middle East. Although, as already indicated, I'll be cautious in making really strong statements as I'm not an expert in the region. And finally, then I will draw a number of modest conclusions. Okay, the background, I think the important message is here. I've been working on the topic for a while. Fortunately, I have a partner, and this is Jonathan Fox, and we managed together to get a grant from the German-Israeli Foundation, and that's basically the reason why I'm here. And one of the outlets of this cooperation will be an extended data set. We've already started, or to be more precise, it was Jonathan who has already started to work on, is on groups, how they are discriminated, what kind of grievances they have, to what extent they're involved in political protest and violence. That's what we want to do in the future. What I'm going to talk about now is the so-called R&R data set. It's on rebels and religion. Okay, so what is the motivation for that? I think I'm not telling you something new when I point to the fact that many armed conflicts worldwide have religious overtones, and this has been the case increasingly, and this of course has also resulted in a corresponding increased attention paid by the scientific community. However, many questions are still unanswered. For instance, how the general developments are, how we can explain them, and it's partly given the lack of adequate data. And we, of course, hope to contribute to filling the gaps a little bit. Okay, what we want to find out, or the content of the data set is, we want to know what and how many rebel groups hold what we call theological claims. I will explain that in a minute, and are composed by or affiliated to particular religious communities. And when you look at the conflicts, there are at least two parties involved necessarily. Then we want to know whether there are differences in terms of theological claims between the warring factions, and whether there are differences between them in terms of religious identity, group identity. We want to write a number of papers on that. That's of course important, but I guess I won't bore you with that too much. Let's turn now to the key terms. I know it's very difficult to define religion, and we can agree or not to agree on this. Our starting point is that we believe that religion is a set of ideas to try to explain the world and provide a meaning to the world and the life of humans in it, and they do that by referring centrally to transcendence, to supernatural forces. We know there are different ways of doing that. For social analysis, it's important to think about the worldly, the social implications, and we believe there are many of them. So it's not just one, and the most important ones, and that one that are important for the data set, is first there are the theological ideas on human conduct. That means There are some ideas what we should do in life that can be more things related to religious practice, but they can also speak to political order and human conduct in general, and that can, of course, be important for conflict. And then we have to know that believing in a certain religion also means that we form social identities, and when you have different social identities, this can result in intergroup conflict, in dynamics in one way or the other. These two things, theological differences and social identity differences, they can be combined in one conflict, but often they are separate. That means, for instance, in the Algerian civil war, we had Sunni Muslims on both sides, but one side had a strong theological claim that was incompatible with the government. So that's what we call theological conflict, because it was about the idea of one side to create a theocratic state. That does not necessarily mean that identity is involved. The other conflict we have is interreligious conflict. That is a conflict between two identity groups. Take, for instance, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. I guess you will agree that it's not about the question whether the Pope is a legitimate representative of God on earth. It's just about identity. This is just a conflict where the groups differ, but they do not differ on any particular or theological question. As said before, that can often mean that theology is not involved, but in many conflicts both is combined. You have different identities and a theological incompatibility. However, I think it's difficult to make the distinction. Okay, the variables overview is maybe boring. You will see that during the time when I will talk about the results. Just here about the theological claims, very easily explained. We asked, does the rebel group or the government make any theological claim? We say yes or no, and then we look whether we can assign it to a certain religious tradition. I have to add here that we make we include some subdominations with Christians and Muslims because they are very much important, Shia and Sunni, as well Christian, Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic. Otherwise, or no, I think it's the way that is a list from the Pew Center. We also look at secular ideologies, but because I have limitations in terms of time, I will skip that. Then we look at the religious affiliation. We ask whether the rebel group and or the government is primarily composed by one religious group or claims to represent it. This is yes or no. It can also be a significant minority. I may quickly explain what that means. For instance, look at the government in Syria. The Alevis are an important part, but they do not form a majority within the government. Still, the majority is rather, but it would be wrong not to note that this group has a special influence within the government. And then we have a type of religious affiliation, Buddhist, Christian. Again, it's the same list of religious denominations. And I have to add that for reasons of economic, we count Alevis as Shia Muslims, which is of course debatable, but I don't want to hide that. Okay, then we look at the conflict types. This is what I explained a couple of minutes ago. So we have the theological conflict. Warring factions in diet differ regarding theological claims. This is Algeria, for instance. Interreligious conflict. Warring factions in diet differ regarding religious identities. Okay, coding rules and principles. I skipped that too, I guess, given the time constraints. But if you're interested in the methodological details, I'll be happy to answer that. We have also quality management, and of course, maybe it's interesting to tell you what we did not. Okay, we did not spend a lot of money on it, which is a thing we are sad about. It's of course not an anti-Muslim crusade or any assault on any religious community or religion as a whole. I have to add, and I will be honest about that, we can of course not assess the relative relevance of religion in a given conflict. We can say yes or no, the component is present, but we can't say it's very much important or it's relatively marginal. That's for empirical reasons, because it's very difficult to make really valid statements on that, at least for a huge number of cases. Then we cannot say when for instance, rebels have a claim that they want to create a theocratic state, we cannot assess whether this is genuine, whether they really mean it, or whether it's instrumental, that it's just something they want to gather support with. Okay. Also, I would say, I think I should have to add, we only look at armed conflict. There's a special kind of conflict that means, you know, a more isolated terrorist attacks and things like that, or unorganized violence in the form of riots is not included in this data set, which of course limits its meaning. Okay, let's turn to the results worldwide. Quickly, the darker blue is the rebel groups with theological claims. What you can see clearly here is that the number of rebel groups with theological claims have been on the rise. Especially, it's interesting to look at 3 historical dates that might be important here. It's 1979, and I think at least 2 historical events come to mind. That is the Iranian Revolution, that may be connected to that, and it's also the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. And that may explain the increase in numbers. Then we also have the end of the Cold War around 1990, when the number of theological conflicts or groups with theological claims starts to rise, and that also makes sense, but because it could be that after the Cold War there might have been a need for a different strategy to mobilize. And then finally, the third date is around 2001 and after, and I think I don't have to explain why that may matter. Okay, this is the share of conflicts worldwide. That is not the number, but the share, and the share means that it has been on the rise as well, and at the moment it's around 45, a little bit more than less than 45%, 40%. So it means it's on the rise, and it's a substantial share. It's not just an unimportant phenomenon. Here we look at the types of theological claims, as we say, that is the religious traditions to which that types are attached. I think you won't be surprised that it's mostly Sunni Muslim. Okay, that's something to be expected. We also have a bunch of Shia rebels, and we have some Christians too. Here Catholic is purple and light blue is Protestant. You find them, for instance, in India and partly in Africa. I think we also have one other folk religion, but that's something else. Okay, but it's mainly a Sunni phenomenon. This is the number of theological claims of conflict governments. By this term, I mean governments that are in a conflict, and we only have Shia and Sunni theocratic states. For instance, here I think the darker green represents Iran. And I think the other ones are, for instance, Saudi Arabia and other. Okay, number of theological and interreligious conflicts. Again, this is just a number. Maybe I show you the shares in the long run, and you can see the lighter blue is the different religious affiliations. That means when we have 2 different groups, no theology or religious ideas involved necessarily, and we can see, you know, there's no clear trend, so it oscillates a little bit around, let's say, 45% or something. The interesting thing is that, again, after the 1979 mainly, and the other dates I told you about, you know, the number of theological conflicts, you know, is catching up, and now is approximately the same. Okay, let me turn quickly to the results of the Middle East. Again, I want to be a little bit cautious here because I'm not an expert. This is the number of rebels and conflict governors with theological claims in the Middle East. We also can see that the number has been on the rise. The shares also, although I think here the denominator is not the right one. Type of theological claim by rebels in the Middle East. Okay, that's Sunni and Shia. This is not a surprise either, I guess. Here is the governments. I skipped that, and that's the number of interreligious conflict in the Middle East. And maybe this graph is maybe more telling, especially with an addition in this text box. You know, when we look at the period between 2000 and 2013, we find that 66% of the years with conflict had a theological incompatibility between the warring factions. 80% had different religious affiliations, and 85 had either or both. Which basically means that only 15% do not have a religious overtone in the Middle East, and it means that the religious aspect of conflict is way above average in the Middle East, which, however, at the same time does not mean that there's no religious conflict in other continents. Latin America has a little problem with religious conflicts, but for instance in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, and especially South and Southeast Asia, you have some conflicts. Okay, now quickly to the religious minorities. We're talking about religious minorities. These are the countries with armed conflicts since 2000. And here I look whether there are groups with theological claims, whether there are groups with religious identities differing from the government, and then I look at the question, do they represent a religious minority? And in the case of Israel, yes, in a way we have that. In Iran, that's the case too. In Iraq, mostly yes. Some were also Shia. In Syria, no. But the Sunni Muslims that have taken up arms against the government are politically relatively deprived. In Turkey, the rebels represent the minority, the Kurds, but not a religious minority. And in Yemen, I think it's partly true as well. Okay, now we can say, okay, most of the religious rebels represent religious minorities and or groups that are relatively deprived. So we can say, okay, there is maybe a clue why the rebellion is there. However, if you have a look at the minorities in general, and I took the data from Jonathan for that matter, and for that question, then we find that most of the groups of the minorities do not rebel. That is, I'm not looking at North African cases, so it's a little bit less minorities. 34 out of 38 minorities have not taken up arms, so that is almost 90%. So it's not so easy to explain why that happens. It's also that religious armed conflict in the Middle East, and you have noticed that maybe, is a Muslim phenomenon, whatever that means. So I'll be cautious on trying to explain that. There are a number of hypotheses, but I think they should be put to the test. No other minorities form rebel groups, although many groups exist. You hear Alawi, if that's not Muslim, Baha'i, Buddhist, and many other. Some explanations could include that some of the minorities, other than the Muslim minorities, are very small, so don't have the capacity to really put up a rebellion. It could also be that this Shia-Sunni divide is something that creates more tensions and has a stronger potential for creating armed conflict than others. But okay, we have many other hypotheses for that. Okay, all this are of course very preliminary findings, and the analysis does not include other forms of dissent and protest, such as in Bahrain. And we also have to look at Fox for further results. So you listen to him, and further research is of course necessary. The conclusion, very quickly. Oh, you're just waiting for the 1 minute? I have still 1 minute. Okay, then I'll be slow. Okay, religious armed conflict. Armed conflicts form a substantial share of armed conflicts, so it's not a marginal phenomenon. The interreligious conflicts have always been important, and that's okay. That makes sense when you think about that. Often ethnic and religious boundaries run parallel. So often it's a mix, and it's difficult to tell is it religion or it's ethnicity. That's sometimes maybe it's both. Then theological conflicts are on the rise and have caught up with interreligious conflicts, especially after important historical dates. And it still has to be investigated how these events trigger the rise, or whether it's the other way around. Then in the Middle East, the share of religious conflicts is very high and much higher than global average. Also Svensson, I think, has data on that in the same book in the same journal volume where Jonathan has published his results. Then it's just less than 20% of the conflict without religious character in one way or the other. And religious rebellion is, at first glance, is a minority phenomenon. But not all minorities do rebel, and that's why, and I repeat myself, further research is necessary, and this is already the point where I have to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to it.